it. I'm not a great computer scientist myself, but how often is the word wisdom mentioned in the New York Times? Because they have a very good, keep all their articles online, you can search. Far less than any word you could imagine. And yet, what could be more important? No, it's not in the global conversation. Every day I read about various people, miscreants, criminals, awful human beings, and there's, well, he's a Rhodes Scholar, or, you know, she went to Harvard and then went to Yale and got an advanced degree. And so what? Are they wise? Do we want them ruling us or leading us or having control over our life? Never mention that. And even get it in the New York Times to mention the word wisdom now and then. I mean, one of the guys who was always lauded in the press as someone I had leading knowledge of, a guy named Larry Summers, who was a big economist and so forth. This man, he should be in the Guinness Book of World Records. He was too arrogant for Harvard. Do you know what it takes? Can you imagine? It would be like saying you're too good a basketball player to play for the Warriors. Something like that. It's just not possible to be that. And yet he was. They had to throw him out. He was president of Harvard. He got demoted because he was too arrogant. That's an astounding thing to say about someone. But yet he was always held up as being the nephew and son of Nobel Prize winner. Just a very, very analytically smart guy. But wisdom? I mean, getting it into the conversation would be a really valuable thing. Another aspect of wisdom that we haven't spoken about too much, sort of an interesting thing to think about, is if you could think of groups of people, classes of people, are some wiser than others. I don't mean national, we talked about countries, so going in and out of wisdom phases, but again, an interesting bit of research that's published from. There's now people who study wisdom. At the University of Chicago, they have a big institute now, and the University of Waterloo in Canada also has people who are studying wisdom. It turns out that people who have less money are wiser than people who have a lot of money. Now, I know that sounds, even I have said, come on, how could you measure that? We began trying to think, well, how, I read the article on it. But there's some truth to that. If you think people who are very successful in life, not all, clearly not all, but a fair amount, at least the ones I've met in my life, think that they're successful, therefore they must be wise. Not lucky, not focused, not driven, but they must be wise if they're successful. Therefore, they don't listen to other people. This was said actually 560 years ago by a great Frenchman named Montaigne, who said, no man who is successful over 50 ever listens to anyone again. And if you ever hang out with such people, as I've been forced to in my life, you find out that that's really somewhat true. So people who are very sick tend to think, well, I already know this. I am wise because I'm rich. That needs to be a postcard or something, saying, if you're so smart, you know, how come you're not rich? I mean, people think that way. But it turns out the truth is the opposite. That generally people of more humble accomplishments or humble wealth accumulation turn out to be wiser than people who aren't. Again, even people who inherit money, like our president or people like that, they think they're sort of naturally wise because their parents made money. But again, you meet such, if you hang around in the world long enough, you meet such people. So getting this word into the conversation, talking about it, when in your own life, in your own, you know, there's a Protestant hymn right in the corner where you are. People sometimes ask me, what should I be doing? I said, look, you're not going to change it. Maybe you will change the world, but the odds are against it. Change the area, change the people you speak to, talk about. Look, when people mention, is that person wise? What do you mean by wise? Is that good? No, I said, no, it's not the same word as good. It's certainly not the same word as intelligence. I have to believe that. It's pretty strong.
Sorry, how have you described wisdom?
Well,
how have you defined it? I'm sorry.
Well, again, this is a tricky question. Dalit mentioned attributes of wisdom earlier today, and we had some other talks. This is a tricky word because it's a thing, it's a way of action at the same time. I mean, no one is wise all the time. It's just, unless you're a saint maybe, and even then I'm not sure. So it's an attribute, an action, activity. It's a hard word. It's one of those words like comedy I was telling my wife about this just yesterday. There are words that if you try to define them, you get closer and closer, the word runs away.
Can I just say that? I'm a social scientist, so I know that in order to measure something, you've got to be able to define it.
You can't measure this.
So I'm going to propose, let me just say,
Yeah.
that it's not a word, it's a concept.
Well, you can say that, sure. I mean, it is a word technically, but it is a concept. It's an attribute, it is a concept. And it's a hard thing. I'd like you all literally to think about what that word means. When you use the word wisdom, what are you talking about? There's a lot of words we use that it's very, very hard. Love would be one. Patriotism, piety. There's a lot of words that are tricky to define. You get close to it, and it's evanescent. It disappears. Humor is one. Another one. I'm just reading a book about that. So it's a tricky word. Define it yourself. But like, what did the Justice Brennan said about pornography? You know it when you see it. I really did. And there are things in life, there's a whole term for this, that you can know it when you see it, but it's very hard to define. It's a good word to wrestle with. That would be the right word, like Jacob wrestling with God, the angel of God. Wrestle with the word. What does this word mean? When you say someone is, all of us use that word. If I asked you, think of, maybe we'll do that next week, think of someone who's wise, tell us why they're wise. You could do that. And yet, it's hard to define it. But that's a good question you're asking. I agree with you. So I thought I'd also like to talk to you now, since it's not a difficult word to say who's wise, what is wisdom. What are the enemies of wisdom? Both in society, collectively, and individually. How come people aren't wise? Now, again, humans are flawed vessels, so we don't have to get into that. What's wrong with people? We spend the rest of our lives here. Here's what's wrong with me. I used to be able to read very clearly without glasses. So the greatest wisdom I probably could teach you is just don't get older. There's very little to it, as many of you found out. So some of the practical, again, I'm trying to be practical enemies of wisdom, not so much for individuals, but in society. And I've listed a few here, but again, this is a subject that you can think about for yourselves. To my mind, the number one, the rabid individualism of the Anglophone countries. Rabid individualism of the Anglophone countries, the countries that where English is the native language. So what do I mean by that? When I was a boy, one of my father's heroes was Albert Einstein. This was true for many Jewish people. He really held up not only a great wise man, but absolute genius. So I remember when Einstein died, I think I was 10 or 11, and I said, what actually did he do? My father was no physicist, believe me. But he said in 1905, he wrote 5 equations when he was working as a clerk in the patent office in Switzerland that revolutionized all the physics. No kidding, by himself at his young age writing 5. I mean, that's a hell of an achievement. So I believed that, everyone believed that, it was sort of standard doctrine. And I got older and I studied, I took quite a few graduate classes and studied the history of ideas. That's the field I was in. And I came to realize that that's not a true statement. He certainly wrote those equations. He certainly revolutionized physics. What was untrue with that statement? He didn't do it alone. No one does things like that alone. Einstein's correspondence, is an enormous amount of books. I tried to look it up, I'm sorry, I just forgot to, but his correspondence is a tremendous amount of books. He knew every other physicist in Central Europe, all these genius physicists in Germany, Hungary, Italy, Denmark. He knew them all. They were writing to each other. You don't get an Einstein just out of the blue like that. It doesn't happen. It may happen in some fields like music, like a Mozart or something. It doesn't in physics. He was just had an imaginative leap. This is taking nothing away from what he did. An imaginative leap. So he knew all the other physicists and boom, jumped ahead a little bit and wrote 5 equations. It takes nothing away from his genius. We constantly put people up as individuals. A more mundane, to put a mildly, example of Steve Jobs. Everyone thinks on his own, he just created Apple Computer, designed these wonderful products, taking nothing away from him as a businessman or as a designer. I had a colleague, a guy I used to work with, who ran Xerox PARC, John Seeley Brown. But Steve Jobs is hanging around all the time, looking what other people did, sort of tweaking what they did. Again, that's a fine thing to do, but he didn't do it himself. No one does anything by themselves. And individualism, the way we elevate it, yes, this person's the hero, this person's this. It just doesn't help in inculcating wisdom, because it tells you wisdom's an individual thing, and it's not. It's a social thing. However we define it, it's social. You're not going to be the only wise person in any setting you're in, any tribe, any country. It doesn't happen that way. And we just elevate this individual. I mean, I could give you, we all have hundreds and thousands of examples. Well, anything great is done together. You may make an imaginative leap. You may have a great focus and force. Steve Jobs, oh, we're going to make these computers that look better and so forth. That's wonderful. I mean, again, full of admiration for them. But these books, I mean, the founding fathers, all this stuff is constantly holding up people as individuals rather than groups, networks, communities, whatever word you'd like to use for an aggregate. That's where you find it. So individual is a great enemy of wisdom, because you're thinking it's an individual. You can't be wise alone. You just can't be wise alone. It doesn't happen that way. You can't be anything really alone unless you're living in a very, very different world. So it's important to understand that. The second greatest enemy of wisdom, I don't often say this, but it's true. Something that religions know, but we got away from it. And this is the separation of emotions from intellect or analytics. In response to the abuses of organized religion that occurred in Europe in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, I mean, these churches were fairly corrupt. Not the ideas, but the people. Many philosophers began to talk about, well, emotions are over here and analytic is over here. They're separate spheres. Some of this came from misogyny. They thought women were emotional, men are analytical. And this stuff got codified by Descartes, who talked about these things as separate, the analytical part of the brain and the emotional part of the brain. Again, they didn't want the emotional part thrown together because the religions abused that, and women talked about emotions. And it got really solidified in the French Enlightenment. So that came down to us. They're separate things. I remember being even told stuff like that. Cheap psychology, and junk psychology, we call it. Well, it turns out none of this is true at all. There's a wonderful book by Anthony Damasio called Descartes' Era. A very, very good book. They talk about there's no separation between intellect and emotion. They're the same. You can't separate them. You just can't. It's not doable physiologically, neurologically, any way you want to talk about it. There is no separation. We can use clearly if someone gives you a quadratic equation and you can solve it, you're using some analytic tool. And if someone, speak up, sure, it's your turn.
You know, when Sotomayor was questioned to become Supreme Court Justice, they were critical about the idea that she was using her background and emotional wherewithal to put into the equation of the intellect.
It must have been so hard for her not to tell those. He said, "You idiots! I graduated." She graduated top of a class in Harvard, and on top of all that, they said. In fact, Obama was criticized because he said he wanted an empathic judge. It's hard to even believe some of this stuff. It goes against. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. And she said maybe it's good for a Latino woman to be on the court and have a different perspective, which of course is absolutely true. This is not so much about her. I mean, Scalia, a person I don't particularly care for, but he said, you know, we have a Supreme Court, 6 went to Harvard Law School, 2 went to Yale, and 1 went to Princeton, or something like that. Yeah. And he said, maybe we should have judges from other parts of the country who didn't go to these schools. Dead right. Mm-hmm. I mean, so it's not just one side. But you're absolutely right about her. So that's another tremendous era, that the separation of analytics from emotions. I mean, wisdom, if nothing else, has a strong emotional component to it. You have to feel empathy. You talk about caring about others, thinking about the future. These are somewhat emotional things as well. Our language is such, English is such, so I said the Anglophone country, that it's hard to even speak about some of these terms in ways that are very concrete, that are very discrete. Unfortunately, the language limits us. Certainly another tremendous enemy of wisdom is the astounding abstractiveness, the abstraction of many things we talk about and many ways we teach. We use abstract terms. Take a great story, let's talk about stories. So Teddy Kennedy, the Kennedy family endowed to a large extent, used their influence and their money to build the Kennedy School at Harvard University. Which is, a very prestigious school teaching, quote, politics, unquote. So Teddy Kennedy was a very grounded man, maybe too much so, but certainly not an abstract thinker. He, after a few years, the school was up and running, and they had all these famous scholars. So he sat in on some classes, and he couldn't even understand them. He's a very successful U.S. senator. I mean, he knew how the Senate worked. He got bills passed. He was very good at that. He said, "What are we teaching? Well, we're not teaching stories. We're teaching really hard stuff." He says, "But I don't even recognize it as being about politics," which is true. I have actually taught a little bit at the Kennedy School one time. I didn't even understand what they were talking about either. I couldn't stand it. And I'm not holding up Harvard in any sort of negative way. Take a class in political science. It looks a little like mathematics. Take a class in sociology. People don't recognize it. It's neither. Everyone has physics envy. Everyone wants to be this scientism. You have to be scientific for it to be real, and you don't recognize the groundedness, what this is actually about. Can you recognize it? If I hear people speaking in ways which is not related, if I can't understand it, it's not. I would just walk out, or I don't finish the book, or I'll say, "I'm sorry, this makes no sense to me." Psychology, sociology, political science, you name it. They all have this. Economics is a really terrific one in this idea, which is now totally divorced from the way we live, and people don't recognize. Become a branch of mathematics. Again, some of that's fine, some of that's okay, but a great chunk of it just, we have people running. Luckily, occasionally these economists, like Janet Yellen at the Fed, has a core of common sense. She's from Brooklyn, so I have to say that. And so she actually understands that when you do something, it affects other people's lives, their day-to-day life in terms of money. But this rabid abstractionism, physics envy, some people call it, all these social sciences want to be taken seriously. They have to look more like physics and look more like this stuff is a deep enemy of actual practical wisdom. What is this about? What are you talking about? If you do A, what will happen to people? If you do B, what will happen to people? Nothing like that. I mean, this all came about through, I don't know, a long history about this, I'm running out of time, but it came about a little bit after World War II when things like operations research and the RAND school, they began to promulgate that the way we've been thinking about all sorts of subjects is too loosey-goosey, too anecdotal, too case-based. Because we won the war using operations research, getting all these ships built quickly, which is true. That must be true for all aspects of human life. That's how you got Robert McNamara. That's where he came from. That's where you got the way these schools all switched from teaching practical wisdom to teaching forms of mathematics that are now relabeled in these other subjects, these other areas. I mean, so much stuff you can go on about that forever. Groundedness. If you're going to talk about practical wisdom, you have to, what's the truth of the soldier on the ground? I'll give you another example. I like talking examples to be grounded myself, something I know a little about. At West Point, they train officers in the United States Army. And they too bought into this whole abstractedness. How do you fight a battle? Well, you use all these analytical tools. A general was very interested in learning how this is done, so he sat in on these classes as they were teaching future officers how to fight battles. He had fought in World War II. He had direct commanded men in battle. He didn't recognize what he was seeing. It was all little X's and boxes on the things, and using quick heuristics and calculations. He said, "What does this have to do with fighting?" So, of course, he was not listened to. But as luck would have it, he got control of West Point. I think they send these guys out to pasture, so you can just run away.